Why did CJ have to leave Los Santos? Did he truly do it of his own free will, or was he forced into it? If you've played GTA San Andreas, you know that nothing in this game is black and white. Corruption, betrayals, and a ruthless struggle for power put CJ in a no-win situation. And the biggest player in this deadly game was Frank Tenpenny, a cop who, instead of fighting crime, fueled it. Today we're going to unravel this story and answer the question, why was CJ forced to leave the city? We'll analyze all the key moments, from Crash's blackmail to the downfall of Grove Street families and the behind-the-scenes decisions that shaped the protagonist's fate. If you thought you already knew everything about this, prepare to be surprised. Los Santos was a city where the law existed only on paper. The streets were ruled by gangs, but real power belonged to those who were supposed to uphold order, the corrupt officers of the Crash Unit. Their leader, Frank Tenpenny, didn't just ignore crime, he controlled it, making deals with gangs and eliminating anyone who could pose a threat to his empire. CJ returned to Los Santos after his mother's death, but he quickly became a target for Crash. Tenpenny and his men knew exactly how to keep him on a leash. They planted a weapon on him, one used in the murder of another cop, and threatened that if he didn't dance to their tune, he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. Carl had no choice. On one side, gang wars were raging. On the other, the police were taking out anyone who stood in their way. Tenpenny was a master manipulator. He didn't want to get rid of CJ right away because he knew he could still use him for his own purposes. And just like that, Carl became yet another puppet in his twisted game of power. CJ returns to Los Santos, thinking that his biggest challenge will be rebuilding his family and restoring the lost glory of the Grove Street families. But he doesn't yet realize that he's walked straight into a trap set by Frank Tenpenny, a man who could destroy anyone's life with a single move. Tenpenny wasn't just any cop. He was the architect of chaos, the mastermind of a hidden game where everyone was just a pawn. And CJ, he was about to become one of them. The blackmail from Crash was only the beginning. CJ had no choice. Either he did exactly what Tenpenny told him to, or he'd be framed for the murder of a cop and spend the rest of his life behind bars. And these weren't just empty threats. In a world where the police did whatever they wanted, and the courts trusted officers more than a kid from the projects, Carl was already fighting a losing battle. Tenpenny knew exactly how to push people to do his bidding. He didn't rely on brute force, at least not right away. He preferred to manipulate, to give the illusion of choice, when in reality, CJ was already on a leash. While Carl struggled with his own fate, the Grove Street families were falling apart before his eyes. What was once one of the most powerful gangs in Los Santos was turning into a shadow of its former self. The reason? Betrayal, secret deals, and the ruthless politics of the streets. But the biggest blow of all came from someone CJ trusted the most, Big Smoke, a man he considered family. Smoke didn't just switch sides to join the Ballas, he did it in the biggest way possible. He grabbed a piece of the drug empire for himself and completely shattered GSF from the inside. The Grove Street families never had a real shot. Sweet, the gang's leader and CJ's older brother, was arrested, and the rest of the crew scattered in panic. The Ballas took over the streets while Tenpenny and his men simply watched from the sidelines, pleased that their plan was working perfectly. In this whole setup, CJ was nothing, a meaningless pawn with nowhere left to go. The city that was once his home had turned against him, and every move he made could be his last. When CJ returned to Los Santos, he thought he was the one calling the shots. He wanted to rebuild the Grove Street families, fix things with his brother, and settle the score with those responsible for his mother's death. But reality hit him fast. After Big Smoke's betrayal, the gang's downfall, and Sweet's arrest, it became painfully clear that CJ wasn't in control of anything. That's when Frank Tenpenny made his next move. He removed Carl from the game entirely. The scene where Crash picks CJ up after the events of the Green Sabre says it all. He's thrown into a car and driven far away from the city, dumped in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but wasteland. Tenpenny doesn't even need to resort to violence. A few well-placed words are enough to make it clear. Carl needs to stay out of Los Santos. This wasn't just about keeping him away from gang business. Tenpenny knew CJ was too stubborn to give up. The only way to truly control him was to physically remove him from the city. By then, Los Santos was fully under Crash's influence. The Ballas ran the streets, Big Smoke was building his drug empire, and Tenpenny had everything locked down. The last thing he needed was CJ getting in his way and trying to rebuild something that was already destroyed. Carl wasn't useful to him at that moment, but he could still serve a purpose elsewhere. By kicking him out of the city, Tenpenny wasn't just eliminating a threat, he was also keeping his options open for the future. At that moment, CJ understood the harsh truth. He had never really been free. There was nothing left for him to do in Los Santos, but even outside the city, he was still being watched. Tenpenny had let him live, but only on his terms. Carl's fate was sealed. As long as Crash held power, he was just a pawn in their game. The only question now was, how long could he keep avoiding the next move from the corrupt cop? When Crash threw CJ out of Los Santos, it might have seemed like he had finally regained his freedom. But the reality was completely different. Carl had no control over his own fate. Frank Tenpenny didn't remove him from the city because he had stopped being a problem. Quite the opposite, CJ was still too valuable to kill, but too dangerous to be left unchecked. That's why he was sent to San Fierro and Las Venturas, where his actions still served Crash's interests, even though Carl himself didn't realize it yet. The tasks he carried out outside of Los Santos weren't random. While CJ thought he was acting on his own terms, he was actually eliminating people who could threaten Big Smoke's drug empire and Crash's shady dealings. Missions that seemed like revenge against those who betrayed him were, in reality, part of a much bigger plan. Carl was wiping out competition, removing witnesses, and every move he made fit perfectly into the puzzle designed by Tenpenny. But despite operating far from Los Santos, the city never left his mind. He knew he couldn't return, yet he might as well have been in a cage. The only difference was that now the walls were wider. Tenpenny made sure Carl stayed away as long as everything in Los Santos ran according to his plan. But why was Tenpenny so afraid of CJ's return? The answer was simple. Carl was a threat to the entire system the corrupt cop had spent years building. If CJ came back too soon, he might start rebuilding the Grove Street families, and that would mean trouble. It wasn't just about the gangs. Carl was the only person who could truly shift the balance of power in Los Santos. Despite holding absolute power over the city, Big Smoke was nothing more than a puppet in Crash's hands. If CJ returned and confronted him, the entire structure could collapse like a house of cards, and that was something Tenpenny simply couldn't allow. As long as Carl was kept away, Los Santos remained under the control of the Ballas, Los Santos Vagos, and of course Crash itself. In reality, CJ wasn't just thrown out of the city, he was effectively cut off from any chance of reclaiming what he had lost. Tenpenny knew all too well that if Carl ever returned, he would fight, and a war would bring chaos that could spiral out of control. That's why, as long as everything remained stable, CJ had no right to come back. Los Santos was a closed arena, and Carl could only enter it when Tenpenny decided the time was right. For a long time, CJ was forced to stay away from Los Santos, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. As long as Tenpenny had the city in his grip and the Ballas ruled the streets, returning would have been suicide. But as is always the case in these kinds of power plays, nothing lasts forever. At some point, the system that once seemed untouchable began to crumble. The spark that ignited the fire was Frank Tenpenny's trial. After years of acting with impunity, he was finally dragged into court, and the people of Los Santos felt that change was coming. The city erupted, riots broke out, the streets were in chaos, and order collapsed. This was the moment CJ had been waiting for. After months spent away from the city, he could finally return, and this time, no one could stop him. CJ's return to Los Santos wasn't just about reclaiming his neighborhood, this was a mission. Carl had no intention of simply bringing back the Grove Street families. He was out to put an end to the reign of those who had destroyed his life. Big Smoke, Tenpenny, the Ballas, they were all going to get what they deserved. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. The story of CJ and GTA. San Andreas isn't just about a gangster trying to restore the former glory of his crew. It's the story of a man thrown into the middle of a power struggle where the real bosses weren't the street gangsters, but the corrupt cops pulling the strings behind the scenes. From the very beginning, Frank Tenpenny knew exactly how to keep CJ under control. Blackmail, manipulation, and finally, physically removing him from the city. It was all part of a bigger plan. Tenpenny wouldn't let Carl return as long as he was a threat. Meanwhile, CJ, despite believing he was acting on his own terms, unknowingly carried out Crash's agenda for a long time, eliminating rivals and securing their interests. But no power lasts forever. When Tenpenny's system started to crumble, CJ finally got his chance. The chaos that erupted in Los Santos became his opportunity to return and settle the score. In the end, it was CJ who came out on top. Not because he was the most powerful, but because he survived. CJ started the game as a pawn, but he ended it as the winner. And Tenpenny, like every tyrant, he thought he was untouchable, until the time came to pay the price.